Good evening, everyone. I am Scarlen Valderaz, the Public School Advocacy Associate at Parents Defending Education. I am so happy that you were able to join us. So tonight we'll be talking about a topic that might be new to you: ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is a subject that might be taught in your child's school. It sort of sounds nice until you realize that it seeks to tear people apart and paints a hideous picture of the United States. It's taught in K 12 schools from California to Boston. Ethnic studies sounds like it would introduce your child to different ethnicities. In reality, it's critical race theory, or CRT by another name. So, here to discuss the topic with me is L. Rachel Lerman from General Counsel at the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. And we have Wenyuan Wu, Executive Director of Californians for Equal Rights Foundation. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. So first, let's set the stage. Wenyuan, what is ethnic studies? What do people think it is, and what is it actually?
Well, thank you, Scarlen, for the kind introduction, and good evening. It is an honor to be here. Ethnic studies, in theory, should be a field of inquiry about teaching history of different ethnicities and cultures throughout the United States. According to AB 2016, which is a California bill that mandated the development of a model curriculum in ethnic studies for California's K-12 students, the goal of ethnic studies is to prepare students to become global citizens with an appreciation for the contributions of multiple cultures and understanding of different ethnicities throughout America. This is what ethnic studies should be and what most people think it is. Unfortunately, subsequent developments in California and beyond have totally betrayed this original goal and rendered ethnic studies a Trojan horse for critical race theory. In spite of tens of thousands of dissenting public comments, the California Department of Education last year approved a highly contested model curriculum, which was laden with ideological jargon such as four eyes of oppression, critical consciousness, intersectionality, double helix, and radical healing. While this state model, first in the country, has clear leanings into critical theory and critical pedagogy, it is not a mandatory curriculum for individual school districts. Local control, in this case, however, has created ample opportunities for a more radical version of ethnic studies, namely the Liberated Ethnic Studies model curriculum, to emerge as the most successful curriculum on the market in California today. Closely resembling the state-rejected first model, the Liberated curriculum is pushed by the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium. According to this group, ethnic studies centers the radicalized and racialized experiences, intellectual traditions, cultural and ancestral knowledge of liberation struggles of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The conceptual focus, therefore, is on indigeneity, intersectionality, counter-narratives, self-determination, and sovereignty. Liberated ethnic studies, furthermore, advocates for critical race theory as a theoretical lens because, according to the liberated ethnic studies people, the discipline is an anti-racist project. In reality, the hijacking of genuine and constructive ethnic studies by CRT or critical race theory means a highly divisive, race essentialist teaching paradigm that places victimhood, power struggles, and racial identities at the center of instruction. The sample lesson on Chinese railroad workers, for instance, argues that Chinese laborers' contributions to American infrastructure have been ignored to exemplify the white supremacy view of US history. Then the sample lesson advises students to analyze the Transcontinental Railroad's project through systems of power, racism, and exploitation. By and large, the movement to promote ethnic studies in America's K-12 classrooms is motivated by ideology, and we know it. It is eerily similar to my schooling experience in China almost 2 decades ago, where elementary school students as young as those in fourth grade were required to take courses on Marxism, Maoism, and Leninism, indoctrinating young kids towards this political orthodoxy of so-called liberation ideas overtakes real education. In October 2021, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law AB 101, the state mandate requiring ethnic studies as a high school graduation requirement, starting with the class of 2030. This latest development, coupled with a decade-long movement to introduce and propagate ethnic studies principles in the state's K-12 schools, has made California the first state to endorse a politicized and polarizing paradigm that's predicated on key concepts of critical race theory and critical pedagogy. But every action invites a counteraction. In the wake of such an aggressive movement to promote ethnic studies that is rooted in critical race theory, it is important to raise public awareness on this issue and build alliances. Last year, my group launched an initiative which galvanized support from 28 partner organizations that represent a diverse range of members from all backgrounds. We sent various joint letters against critical or liberated ethnic studies and against the mandate of ethnic studies to be taught in high schools to the state legislature and to the governor's office. The alliance we've created is truly bipartisan and broad-based.
Wow, that's a lot to take in right now as adults, and now just imagine children having to take all of this in. It sounds pretty crazy to me. um, so, Rachel, your organization has done a lot of work around ethnic studies. Can you tell us what you've been seeing and what parents need to know?
Yes, our group focuses on anti-Semitism, and until recently, we focused on college campuses. But my son, who's in grad school, said to me, "You know, Mom, by the time they get to college, they've already learned all this crazy stuff. You need to look at what people are learning in high school and elementary school." So maybe we could bring that little chart back up that shows the difference between, yeah. So I think most of us think that when we think of ethnic studies, we think we're learning what's on the left here. We think we're learning about inclusivity and diversity and getting to know different kinds of ethnic backgrounds so that we can be, allies and accepting and affirming of each other. But unfortunately, that's not what groups like Liberated Ethnic Studies are after at all. And this is from their website, and they're showing you that the stuff on the left is wrong and the stuff in green is correct. And there's a lot of, kind of buzzwords in there that most of us, don't understand. But I can tell you that I'm in California, and we went through several iterations of the model curriculum for ethnic studies. And as you've been told, lots and lots of parents from lots of different groups, I think there were 26 groups and tens of thousands of people objected to the original curriculum, which was created by Liberated Ethnic Studies. And then they did it again, and they did it again, and they did it again, and they finally adopted a model curriculum. And some of the stuff they took out there was an awful lot of anti-Semitic content that was taken out. There was also the notion that all Americans are either white oppressors or what we call BIPOC, so indigenous or persons of color, and that America is the product of centuries of settler colonialism and white supremacy. So they took that language out, and according to the governor, it's not supposed to be brought back in. But we know from just looking at Liberated Ethnic Studies own website that the plan is to bring in under the radar, bring the stuff that was taken out back in. And they had this all over their website. They've taken it down now, but we have equipment to see what was there. And a group called the Deborah Project brought a lawsuit based on the stuff that had been taken down. And the stuff that had been taken down is basically instructing teachers to go under the radar, not to let parents know what's going on, because parents might object, and to learn, to teach lessons that are basically intended to divide students. You know, some of you were white oppressors, some of you are not. And there's only 4 ethnicities that they recognize: Black Americans, Latino Americans or Latinx, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and Indigenous or Native Americans. Now, in the Asian and Pacific Islander category, they include Arab Americans. And that's where they focus on a lot of anti-Israel propaganda, on the theory that Arab Americans come from a part of the world that is recognized as Asia. But Israeli Americans, even though they come from the very same place, are nevertheless white oppressors, no matter what color they are, and no matter what their families have experienced. My grandparents escaped from pogroms in Europe and watched brothers and sisters being murdered in front of them. But now that we're here in the United States, we're white oppressors. And so a lot of Jewish parents are uncomfortable with that portrayal of our particular ethnic group. One of the things that they did when they adopted the model curriculum was put in some guardrails. And they're pretty basic guardrails. The program isn't supposed to reflect, and I'm quoting, or promote bias, bigotry, or discrimination against any person or group of persons based on race, religion, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, ethnic, cultural background, disabilities, or English learners. So that sounds pretty reasonable, but according to Liberated Ethnic Studies, that's unconstitutional in their view. And I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I think they're wrong about that. In fact, the Constitution of California specifically says you're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of these groups. But we anticipate that if there's a legal battle, that's one of the things that will come up is whether these guardrails have teeth and whether the guardrails are constitutional. Maybe we could show that slide of, So this is a slide, and we've seen this in school books under Latino heritage and under Asian American heritage. And the point of this is to show, this is supposed to show that Israel is responsible for racism in America based on the theory, and this is a myth, that American policemen go to Israel to learn how to fight crime using methods like the ones that were used on George Floyd. And that's what this cartoon is all about. What it has to do with Asian Americans is anybody's guess, let alone Latin Americans. But the point is to to bring in anti-Semitic ideas and associate Israel with the kinds of racist endeavors that they are claiming are at the heart of America. So that's what the point of this slide is. There's probably a lot more like this, but it's very hard to get hold of the actual materials that are being taught because they are keeping it under the radar.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the things that caught my attention were the different races that were recognized. You know, living in the United States, we're such a melting pot, so people aren't always just one race. So I wonder how they work through that. You know, there's with my family in particular, my husband is half Mexican and Caucasian, and I'm Mexican American. So our children are half Mexican, half Caucasian. So that's interesting.
And often if there's a Caucasian member of the family, no matter what the children look like, they must go into the white oppressor category.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we've seen that in a few schools.
Yeah.
I have an Argentinian Jewish student who is a person of color, but she was told to get her white privilege in check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I won't get too much into this, but I've actually heard that now there's something called brown privilege. So even if, I guess I don't even know what brown privilege means, but that's maybe a different live stream. Wenyuan, how about you? What are you seeing regarding ethnic studies?
I want to echo Rachel's observation on the pervasiveness of ethnic studies. The Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium has teaching materials targeting preschoolers and kindergarteners. Most of their contents endorse a CRT-based worldview of power, oppression, and intersectional struggles. In this July, for example, the consortium promoted 2 children's books depicting the discovery of Americas strictly through the lens of colonialism. One of the books is titled Christopher the Calogary. It's over, the real history of Christopher Columbus. It's a very long title, but you can see some pages from this book on the screen. The book is being branded as a must-have for every classroom, library, and home to teach the truth about Christopher Columbus, white settler, colonialism, and history of the Americas from the perspective of indigenous and Black resistances. Using very colorful cartoon drawings, playful language, and bilingual translations, this book is essentially a weapon of thought indoctrination into one-sided accounts of American history and activism-oriented lessons for kids ages 5 to 10. So essentially, proponents of critical or liberated ethnic studies have employed this trick called the bait and switch tactic. They bait state education departments, school districts, and the public with a promise of helping students learn about different cultures and ethnicities throughout our country. Then they unapologetically switch that promise with the inculcation of critical race theory, power and oppression, and victimization. So let's take the Asian American Studies sample lessons again as an example. Admittedly, from the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act to the Japanese American internment during World War II to xenophobic attacks against Korean Americans in the early 1990s to current anti-Asian discrimination in educational access, Americans of Asian descent have endured historical marginalization and unfair treatment. Undoubtedly, the liberated ethnic studies folks, they hyper-focus on the struggles and sufferings, but they ignore the overcoming, resilience, perseverance, and contributions of the very dynamic Asian American community. A sample lesson highlights isolated incidents such as the 1869 Chinese railroad strike and the omission of Chinese workers in the image of the 1869 Promontory Point Workers' Meeting as evidence of systemic oppression. Instead of analyzing the complex history of the Asian American community with attention to both the good and the bad, the curriculum is simply obsessed with collective grievances and disempowering narratives to the detriment of our children, of students. Another example is the use of land acknowledgements as a standard feature of all available ethnic studies curricula. A land acknowledgement, namely, is a formal statement about an event or a class taking place on land originally inhabited by indigenous people. In San Diego, students in ethnic studies classes are asked to formally acknowledge that they are standing on the stolen land of Kumaya people. Students are then asked to denounce the history of violence against the Kumaya people. This is, of course, a very oversimplified and inaccurate interpretation of the history of Kumeyaay. The Kumeyaay people of San Diego, turns out, have lived in the region for over 10,000 years and nowadays live on 12 reservations in present day. As a group that greeted the Spanish settlers when they first sailed into San Diego Harbor in 1542, the Kumeyaay population were decimated from about 30,000 to 50,000 in the mid 1700s to 1,000 at the end of the 19th century, not because of systemic racism, but due to smallpox and the waves of Spanish American Mexican settlers. The California model curriculum also featured two religious prayers, the Aztec and the Ashi affirmations. The Aztec prayer component, entitled In Lak'ech, and the Ashi prayer component promote five Aztec gods and the Yoruba religions through repetitive chanting and affirmations of these symbolic principles of these religions, respectively. Notably, the Aztec prayer repeatedly invokes and makes intercessory requests to five male deities whose religious rituals involved gruesome human sacrifice and human dismemberment. Last September, my group sued the state of California and the State Department of Education because these two prayers essentially they violate California Constitution's free exercise of religion and its no government aid clauses. The state settled the case in our favor, agreeing to remove both prayer components from the state model curriculum and also issuing a public notice to all school districts about the removal.
Oh, wow. So, that just got me thinking, and I want to ask both of you here. And I'll start with Wenyuan, but what grades are you seeing this in? Because I actually went through the public school system in San Diego. I was part of the San Diego Unified District from preschool to when I graduated high school. And I remember learning about those tribes. There's a very popular field trip that is taken where students go to Old Town for an entire week and we learn about the history of San Diego and the previous tribes. So when are you seeing this being implemented? What grades?
On the ground, we're seeing ethnic studies being implemented in even kindergarten grades and pre-K schools. I use the example of the Christopher, the Augur book. There's also a new book called Julian is a Mermaid that's being featured by the Liberated Ethnic Studies group in California. And that book is also supposed to be a children's book for elementary as part of the Liberated Ethnic Studies elementary teaching resources.
Interesting. What about you, Rachel?
It is starting to work its way into the elementary schools. My kids both grew up in the LAUSD system, and actually we moved my daughter to a private school when she started high school, but my son was already hearing some of this, kind of one-sided version of American history, even in high school. But he tends to be kind of contrarian, so he was always battling with teachers about it, and is now learning to teach political philosophy in I would say a more traditional vein.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I think the problem that we're seeing, and I'm picking up on something Wenyuan said, is that it's not just that they're teaching about these tragic events in our history. I mean, yes, our children need to know about what happened to the Chinese. They need to know about slavery. They need to know these things. But the problem is that the focus is exclusively on these things, and it's through a single lens. It's a semi-Marxist lens that shows that everything America is based on, white oppression and what they call settler colonialism. And it's really kind of a racist ideology when you look at it. It's because they're in groups and out groups. And, unfortunately, the Jewish students are among the out groups. And you're training a whole generation of kids to think that, oh, these kids are bad. And when we're a minority, but this is a very bad minority as opposed to a good minority. And you're not allowed to bring in anything to show otherwise. So it is like certain communist countries where there's only one way. And if you stand up and object, I know even in high school, my son was often sent out for disagreeing with his teachers.
Oh, he was sent outside of the classroom?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. That is crazy. Yeah. I did want to share a few examples of what parents have sent to us about ethnic studies, again, to show you what is really being done inside the classroom. So one example that we have is from Boston Public Schools. It's Intro to Reoccurring Themes and Concepts for Ethnic Studies, Slavery and Genocide Holding Up White Supremacy and Capitalism. So if you just look at the graphic here, how is the normalization of slavery / racial capitalism, genocide used to uphold capitalism? So what is that? Another example we have is from the North Shore School District in Washington State. And that one promotes on its website the local LGBTQI A2S plus community. One of their joint goals includes creating an ethnic studies framework. So one question that I automatically think of is, what does sexual orientation and gender identity have to do with ethnic studies? And the final example that I have is from Oregon State Kindergarten Ethnic Studies. So here we have ethnic, and we have Native American, African American, Asian Pacific Islander American, Chicano, Latino, Middle Eastern, and then we have the social, so kind of breaking down the different, I guess, victim groups, right? All right, so we and we have the kindergarten standards too as well. So what it used to be back in 2019 and how they re-envisioned it, as we hear that quite often. So we've covered a lot of ground so far. Any further thoughts, ladies?
I would like to just build upon your examples of ethnic studies being taught in states throughout the country, that the movement has also invaded Minnesota, where the state education department is now considering a proposal to add ethnic studies to the state's K-12 social studies standards, with a focus on equity and marginalized communities. This proposed ethnic studies standard also emphasizes sort of a critical lens or critical pedagogy, social identities of race and gender.
Mm-hmm. And Rachel, I think you were on mute when you wanted to add something in.
I would just urge parents to really pay attention to what their kids are being taught in school. In most states, including California, parents have a right to know what their kids are being taught. It may be hard to find out because the teachers are trying to keep things, quiet, especially if they think parents might make trouble or complain.
Mm-hmm.
But if your kid brings home something from school that looks really offensive to you or that denigrates certain minorities, the best thing you can do is let us know. Let Parents Defending Education know. Let groups like mine and Wenyuan know, so that we can gather evidence and show the government and the court what's really going on. Because I think a lot of parents would be appalled to see some of this stuff, and often our kids just, they don't bring it home. They don't show us, but we need to ask.
Yeah, plus our children don't really know any better. We think that they're going to school to have an unbiased, education and unbiased view of history. But when we see things like that, we're like, hey, wait a minute. One thing that I have heard both of you talk about is Liberated Ethnic Studies Curriculum Consortium. It's been mentioned a few times. Who are they, and What's that all about?
Well, they are a group of educators who have a certain outlook. It's kind of an updated version of Marxism that views everything through the same lens, that everything is based on racism, and that's the only thing to focus on as their view of racism. And one of the things they're trying to do in California is make sure that everyone teaching ethnic studies is trained in their particular dogma, so that they don't want normal English teachers and history teachers teaching this stuff, because they're afraid that they won't toe the party line.
They are basically a group of teacher activists and political operatives that have come together even before the state considered a model curriculum for ethnic studies. And their institute provides consulting services targeting school districts that are looking for anti-racist, culturally responsive training, district advertisement and implementation of ethnic studies, professional development, and so on. And the group, or the curriculum that the group is advocating for, have been endorsed by several school districts in California, including Hayward Unified and Castro Valley Unified School District.
We're also seeing it in San Diego and Santa Ana and other parts of California, adopting these curricula. And then parents, we have open meeting rules in California, but they get under that by creating subcommittees that are not subject to these open meeting rules. So often you can't go to meetings. You can go to a school board meeting, and you should, but you won't always hear everything at those meetings.
Okay. Good to know. We do have a few questions from the audience here, so let me give you the first question. So, are there any good versions of ethnic studies that we can propose to our school board or State Department of Education instead of what we're seeing here?
There are several excellent alternatives, I would argue. The Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism has come up with this K-12 pro-human learning standards, which provides essential guidance for teaching and learning about the histories, experiences, and contributions of different ethnicities and cultures in the U.S. The Allen Hidalgo team in Central California, they are a team of high school teachers. They have developed a series of ethnic literature textbooks named Between Two Worlds, a multicultural and multilingual anthology. These books encourage nuanced classical multiculturalism with interesting life lessons. And they also introduce logic, higher thinking, and contextual understanding of different cultures. Last but not least, the Woodson Center has a Black history curriculum called the 1776 Unites curriculum. It is a collection of Black history lessons covering the time period from the early 18th century to the contemporary era. The lessons focus on both the tragedies of racism and the heights of human resilience through teaching key historical events such as the American Revolution, the Civil War, and Jim Crow.
Love it. Thank you for those recommendations. What about those parents, including, parents like myself, we're not living in California or Oregon, Washington State. We're living in a red state, like maybe Tennessee. I'm in Tennessee. Do we have to worry?
I think so. I think we're starting to see these across the country, including in your home state, and in places like Georgia, where you would expect things to be more on the conservative side. The curriculum in many public schools is moving in this direction. So it's up to the parents to take note of that and let the school boards know what they do and do not want.
Okay. All right. So when I bring up ethnic studies, supporters say the school is just teaching history. How do we respond to that?
Well, I think I addressed that a minute ago when I said we want the kids to know about, the mistakes that the United States has made. We don't want to repeat those mistakes. We want to acknowledge them, but we also want to acknowledge what's great about this country and make all kids feel that they're not victims, they're not evil. They all can develop and grow and become a part of America, and that's the aspect of history that we're seeing cut out. So we're not saying stop teaching the bad stuff. We're saying don't just teach it, and don't separate groups of kids into good and bad and set them against one another. We want to all work together to keep America going in a good direction.
I would argue that the denial of teaching critical race theory-based history or ethnic studies is very typical of this island law of woke projection. Denying indoctrination is happening, but when confronted with overwhelming evidence, celebrate it by moralizing. As Rachel said, and I agree with her 100%, history as well as cultures can and should be taught constructively without any political bias, without the dogma of race essentialism or stereotyping. History should be celebrated in its entirety, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there is nothing positive or even educational about teaching our young students that US history is fatally defined by systemic racism, and that the so-called liberatory struggles of ethnic minorities in the country define these communities rather than their overcoming, rather than their achieving the American dream in spite of the odds being stacked up against them, historically speaking.
Nice, well said. And one final question, pretty important question too. So, can I opt my child out of ethnic studies just like I can opt them out of social emotional learning?
Well, not in California, where it's a requirement for graduation. So, the best thing you can do is keep an eye on what's being taught. It's not just ethnic studies classes either. Some of this comes into the English curriculum and the history, and even we're seeing it in math in California.
That's right.
In math?
Yeah.
It's called ethno-mathematics or equity math.
Well, there's not supposed to be a right answer because that would be white supremacy. But we want our kids to add and subtract and multiply and be able to make change.
Right. Count their change at the grocery store.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not
All
fair
right.
not fair to kids to fail to teach them these life skills they need.
Yeah, that's very, very good points. What other thoughts do we have? And Rachel, I'll start off with you. Any final thoughts or comments?
Just, for parents to question and teach their kids to question, why am I being taught this? And why am I being taught, that Israel is a terrible place in the context of American ethnic studies? There's a hidden agenda there. And it's often an anti-Semitic agenda. And we just don't want to, turn into one of the countries that has had such grievous problems that America has, managed to extricate itself from the problems in its history, and that's what we want it to continue to do: be a safe place for all kids.
That's right. Yeah. What about you, Wenyuan? What final thoughts or comments do you have?
I would implore parents who are confronted with this problem of intrusion of critical or liberated ethnic studies in their children's schools to have courage, have moral courage, and speak up. If you can't be the first, at least be the second or the third, and refuse to accept the unacceptable. Get informed, get organized, go to your school board meetings to voice your concerns, form local groups to champion necessary changes, parental rights, parental access, and demand academic transparency. If the education establishment in your area is determined to indoctrinate your child with CRT or critical race theory masquerading as ethnic studies, vote them out and or seek legal challenges in light of apparent discrimination.
Right. Yeah. Perfect segue to our call to action. So just, be aware of what's going on in your child's school and ask questions. You got to be curious and ask questions. You can also find more about ethnic studies at defendinged.org/ethnic studies. And if you see something this school year about ethnic studies that you're concerned about, doesn't really sit well, please send us a message and we can investigate and let other parents know about what's going on. Thank you so much, ladies. This has been packed with information. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.